Welcome to the Sinica Podcast, a weekly discussion of current affairs in China, coming to you from the pop-up Chinese studios here in Beijing. I'm Kaiser Kuo, joined, of course, by Mr. Jeremy Goldkorn, the man behind Danwei.com, a Financial Times company. How are you, Jeremy?
Good evening, Kaiser.
Today, we are talking about sex, and I really hope my mother decides not to tune in this week. We have with us in the studio today none other than Richard Berger, who's author of the book Behind the Red Door, Sex in China, and one of the OG English language bloggers writing about China on the Peking Duck, which has been going for now, my God, Jeremy.
It's 11th year.
11th year. Oh, my God. Well, anyway, welcome to Sinica, Richard. Overdue appearance here.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Kaiser.
So also joining us again is Graham Earnshaw of Earnshaw Books, which published Richard's book. Listeners will remember Graham, of course, from our recent show about unsavory characters, the nonfiction anthology with expat writers put together by Tom Carter and published by the estimable Earnshaw Press. So, Richard, let's jump right in and talk first about the genesis of the book. How did it occur to you that you needed to write a book on the topic of sex in China? Presumably there are a lot of books out there about sex in China. Right?
That's really a misconception. There are very few books out there about sex in China. The ones that are out there, oddly enough, are books written by academics for other academics. Most of them, like R.H. Van Gulik's book on the history of sex in ancient China, are long out of print. And if you want to buy a copy, it can cost you upwards of $150.
Wow.
So to be completely honest, this book wasn't my idea. Graham Earnshaw here approached me to write the book. It was his idea. I was thrilled because this book I recognized right away would fill an important gap. There is no book for mainstream audiences that takes a panoramic view of sex in China from ancient times until today and tells it in an enjoyable way as a narrative with lots of anecdotes and interviews and stories. So I do think the book
Stop
is
reading
unique.
from the book jacket like that.
Sorry.
No, that was good. So like you said, it's a big, grand historical sweep from...
Can I just, being a kind of a vulgar businessman, can I just ask a question? The cliche has it that sex sells. Is it selling? How is the book doing?
Graham, would you address that?
Sure, it's one of our best sellers at the moment. But that doesn't mean that it's going to make us all rich. It simply means that it's doing better than other books. And it's a pleasure to publish any book like this.
And are you selling more digital copies or print copies?
More digital copies. That shift occurred maybe a year or two ago now, and it's really the shift from paper to pixels occurred. It happened already.
And what is the platform that does best for you?
Amazon. Kindle.
Yeah. So you publish it as a Kindle, and those are the most. You
right.
get more out of that.
That's right. We have it in other formats as well, but you can click on anything on the internet, and you might as well click on the biggest. And Amazon really is in a commanding position.
And the Kindle is a rather lovely device. I think I've actually recommended it. I was a latecomer to it, but
Right.
it is a good substitute for a print book if you.
And you can read Kindle. You can use Kindle on iPads and iPhones, which is how I do. Right. You don't have to have an actual physical Kindle.
I have actually Kindle on at least 6 devices
that
I own. I mean, it's crazy. Anyway.
And you can read a book about sex in China without anybody knowing. So let's get back to the book.
Right, funny.
Now they have to know because we're talking about it.
That's right. The greatest thing is that you can actually read it without the guy in the subway knowing that you're reading a book about sex in China and giving you casting dirty looks at you.
So what is in the book, Richard? Can you kind of give us a sort of top-down view of
Sure. The question I'm asked the most about the book is how China's sexual revolution differs from that in the West. And the book looks at that in considerable detail. There's a narrative out there, a belief, that China went through a similar trajectory that the West did, extreme Puritanism during the Victorian era, then a gradual loosening up, and then the sexual revolution just took off, like in the 1960s, do your own thing, co-ed dorms. You had the musical Hair on Broadway where the actors took off all of their clothes. Pornography became legal. The sexual revolution just soared and around.
The pill and all that, right?
Yeah, exactly. China's sexual revolution is far different than that. As I said, the book takes a pretty panoramic view of sex in China. It starts with a chapter on sex in imperial China, which I think should be to most Westerners a very big surprise to learn just how open China was about sex for many, many centuries. It had its back and forth. It wasn't a clear trajectory of sexual openness. So
So yeah, there were a lot of pendular swings, sort of back and forth. It wasn't a clear trajectory.
It wasn't a clear trajectory. It's very fascinating for me to learn about just how open China was with the Taoist sex manuals, for example, that began to pop up around the
As it were.
Yeah, right along the time of Confucius, like 2,500 years ago. These manuals went into extraordinary details about how to give a woman pleasure, how to keep her from reaching orgasm for as long a time as possible, and then moving her on to multiple orgasm. And the whole point of this is to siphon off her yin essence, that is, her vaginal secretions, while at the same time, the man wants to hold on to his yang essence, which is semen. So there's actually a process, this sort of blew my mind, called ejaculation, where just at the best part, as the man is about to ejaculate, he presses down on the prostate, around the ureter, and blocks.
The part that's anatomically known as the taint, I believe.
The
right?
taint, okay. Right. And this stops the semen from leaving the penis and instead diverts it into his bladder, where it's then supposed to rise up and reach his head, so he can really enjoy a healthy dose of yang essence.
Yeah, actually, I mean, when I was a graduate student, I was studying quite a bit about religious Taoism under a gentleman by the name of Dr. Don Harper, and this was one of the things that he specialized in. He explained it as this, that particular yogic practice was called huanjing bunao, I mean,
right.
returning the semen to, or the sperm to repair the brain, as it were. You've seen these little statues carved in walnut or in soapstone of these Taoist sages, right? And they always have these enormous foreheads. Ah, you know what's in those foreheads? Right. It's true. That's what
yeah.
that is.
And there are many Taoist techniques like that I learned about. It was quite extraordinary. But the thing is, there's a lot to say for those techniques. If you look at modern sex therapy today, much of it is about how to
give a woman multiple orgasms. Right?
Giving a woman multiple orgasms, avoiding premature ejaculation, holding off as long as you can. So really, Taoist thought, these Taoist manuals are really at the core of a lot of current sexual therapy.
Right, but they're also just like incredibly sexist. Right? I mean,
terribly.
They were telling men basically sleep with as many women between 14 and 18 as you possibly can, because you can only get so much yin essence from one woman, right?
Right. The benefit is that you can live to be 3,000 years old if you do this.
Wow.
So they say.
I think I'd rather just splooge.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the book also deals with prostitution in China. That's another topic where just learning just how open China used to be in the Tang Dynasty. Prostitutes were registered with the state, and they went in for medical examinations. Now, China got progressively more intolerant of prostitution. And under Mao, prostitution was totally wiped out. It was one of Mao's most marvelous successes.
Well,
but how would you compare it to now? Because I had a...
Wait, let's not get into now first. Let's not even get into Mao first.
Right.
We got to walk through some
no
more of the
Mao,
chapters.
No Mao?
Yeah, no Mao.
Okay.
No.
Right.
Let's go back to
right.
We're going kind of chapter by chapter. So, so you have this imperial China, Sextant Imperial China chapter, and then...
Okay, well, prostitution was my next chapter.
Right.
And that also takes us back from imperial days to now. And like I said, in the imperial days, at many points they were quite tolerant of prostitution. In the Qing dynasty, they outlawed it on paper. It blossomed like never before. I mean, Shanghai and the coastal cities were just notorious for their prostitution. Under Mao, it was truly one of his most stellar achievements. He said he was going to wipe out all the brothels and end prostitution in China, and he really succeeded. He started first with Beijing. He very quickly closed all of the brothels. In Shanghai, he had a much, much harder time of it because the whole economic foundation of Shanghai was built on prostitution to some extent. It was so involved in so many various industries, from cosmetics and clothing to hairstyling to medical visits for venereal disease.
How bad was how bad of a problem was venereal disease at that point?
It was a serious problem because of all of the Westerners screwing multiple prostitutes and all of them coming down with gonorrhea, syphilis, and chlamydia.
It was the Westerners.
It was, to a large extent.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lengthy chapter on dating and marriage and how that process has changed over the centuries, and not so much. I mean, even today, in modern Shanghai, people I interviewed told me how their parents are deeply involved with who they date, and they wouldn't think of getting engaged without bringing their parents into the conversation. This has gone on, well, before 30, 40 years ago, many marriages were set up by the parents. They were
It hardly sounds something like uniquely Chinese, though. I mean, I think a lot of people bring their parents into the process. I mean, my mom doesn't like you, I can't marry you.
Yeah, I think it's much more proactive where the parents, especially the mother, play the role of matchmakers. And as the son or daughter begins to get older, they begin to panic and get more aggressive about having them find a spouse. So I think they're much more proactive about it. Also, people's friends, as they see another friend getting older, they want to set up parties and introduce them to a date and meddle. And it's totally accepted. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just how the Chinese people do it.
Sure. Okay. And then so after your thing on in that chapter you talk extensively about the marriage law of 1950 and how that changed a lot of things. You talk about divorce, which was finally made sort of possible in the marriage law, but was really radically made radically easier in the 1983 revision to it?
Yeah, under Mao, I mean, he made divorce on paper easy to get. In truth, it was very hard, if not almost impossible, to really go through and get the divorce because you needed to get permission from your danwei. There was a whole legal procedure. Divorces certainly did rise, but they didn't skyrocket until the changes you mentioned in the 1980s. And they're skyrocketing today. In fact, it's a popular joke here that you see someone on the street, instead of saying ni churlama, they'll say ni lilama.
Really?
You've gotten divorced. Yes, really. I read it in the Global Times.
It must be true.
I first heard that in 1996, actually.
Yeah, somebody
Really?
actually walked up to you and said, "Have you gotten divorced yet?"
No. A colleague of mine at the time, a Chinese guy, kind of, what we would now describe as a bailing, basically told me that joke.
Well, it's one of those things like they said in the early days of the internet, people would walk up to each other and say, 你今天上网了没有?
你 IT 了吗? 你是
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Anyway.
I'm dubious of
Yeah.
that. So the next chapter then after that is on...
There's the family. That's rather cut and dried about the relationship between husbands and wives, the high rate of spousal abuse. A lot of Chinese men beat their wives, unfortunately. Especially about, of course, the hierarchical structure of the Chinese family, filial piety, and a lot of Confucianism about the family being the building block of society. So another chapter, actually, I'm not going chronologically through the book, but another chapter deals with what I find one of the most fascinating examples of government involvement in people's sex lives. Those are the talk radio shows from the 1990s.
Right. Midnight Whispers.
Midnight Whispers in Shanghai started in 1996. Now, these shows really broke new ground. Finally, listeners could learn that they were not alone with their sexual problems, that other people had the same questions, were suffering, and the hosts of these radio shows would give them sagely advice about how to improve their sex lives. What wasn't maybe so well known was that all of these hosts were highly trained cadres, party members, and all the advice they gave was within the accepted party discourse. Mm-hmm. You might think when you hear these talk radio shows that they were liberating, that they meant more freedom. Well, not exactly. Kathleen Irwin, a sociologist, actually wrote a book about this and said it was an example of the, quote, disinterested interest of the government. They're invisible. They're seeming disinterested. Actually, they're very interested.
Sure.
These shows are for a reason, and the reason is pretty simple. They believe that a sexually satisfied population is a more productive population, less likely to complain, just like Deng's vision that a country that's prosperous financially, they're less likely to worry about revolution and rebellion.
Sure.
They're more likely to be
Brave New
solid
World,
citizens.
orgy, right.
It's Aldous Huxley's vision of the future, right? It's sex play.
Very good.
You have
Exactly.
another chapter.
Right.
You have another chapter about homosexuality in China.
There's a long chapter on
Yeah.
homosexuality in China. That might have been the most fascinating for me to research, to
Yeah.
learn just how open China was in imperial times with homosexuality. And it's not the kind of homosexuality we associate in the West. In China, in ancient times, homosexuality wasn't something that you were. It was something that you did. It was not an identity. The practitioners of it were almost all heterosexual, married men.
Well, I
had
think
children.
A lot of societies were like that. If I'm not mistaken, I think Greece was like that.
Ancient Rome,
right? Ancient Rome was like that. Even the UK. I mean, and in China until fairly recently, it was quite normal for you to experiment, with homosexual love affairs, but then marry a woman, and it was just something you did in your youth.
Yeah, but in China, it was not something you only did in your youth.
Okay.
Basically, it was, first of all, by the way, when we say homosexuality, it was all male. Mostly women were stuck at home where they had to stay. It was men, especially the literati, people with some money, royalty. They had copious affairs. In fact, during the Han Dynasty, the scribe kept a book called the Emperor's Male Lovers, where they actually documented the men that he slept with. It was a sign of prestige. It was a sign of class. The privileged would always be with a boy from a lower social class, and it was a sign of his power and again, prestige.
When you say boy, you really do mean boy, right?
They could be young teenagers, 12, 13, 14.
There you go again, Richard, hurting the feelings of the Chinese
people. Sorry.
Sorry.
And this actually took off like wild in the Qing dynasty. Even though homosexuality was against the law during the Qing on paper, it went through the roof because Beijing opera toward the end of the 19th century became very popular. All these acting troupes came to China, and the boys, to make money on the side, they would dress up as women. They would oil their bodies to look sensual. They would sing and dance for their male clients. They made a tremendous competition for the straight brothels. I mean, the boy brothels were doing even better. Edmund Backhaus, in his book Décadence Manchue, Backhaus just goes into extraordinary details about how these brothels operated and the services that were rendered.
One can't quite take him at his word. I mean, he did, after all, claim to have been sodomized by Tsissi's clitoris, didn't he?
Well, this is the third time now that has been mentioned on this particular show.
I mean, it's the most wonderful detail.
However, I have read
also an Earnshaw Books publication.
It is,
yes. Indeed.
The reprinting of...
Graham has sat silent long enough. I really want to get. Because Graham, you have had a career in China that spans now. I mean, we're in your third decade, fifth. Oh my goodness! So you were here in the late 70s, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. My God. So you, more than anyone, you've seen this happen. The transformation happen. And not only do you have that kind of temporal span here, but you also have a sort of geographic span. In the last few years, you've been walking across China.
That's right.
You've been walking from Shanghai all the way to Tibet, right? Where have you gotten at this point?
Chengdu. In fact, I'm not going to walk to Tibet now. I've decided to hang a Louis to turn left at Chengdu and walk south to Guiyang.
Okay, so Guiyang is going to be your end?
No, there is no end. Then I'll turn left again and walk to Fujian, and then I'll decide whether I'm going to turn left and go back to Shanghai for afternoon tea, or turn right and go round to Hainan. I haven't decided yet, but I intend to never stop.
Right, and so what you do is you walk and then you fly back.
That's right. I always go back to exactly to the millimeter to the place where I last stopped walking. And so I'm walking from one random place on the planet to another random place, and it is absolutely the best way to do travel. But it means, because it's everything is spontaneous, everything is unknown.
Right, and so I bring this up because that's brought you to cities large and small, and you've been able to see so not only across time but also across space.
And had many conversations. The joy of the walk is to talk to people and ask them questions. And because they've never had any media training, they have no way of defending themselves against questions. I ask them a question, they answer the question. And so sex was a topic that came up many, many times in the thousands of conversations that I've had with the peasants and the farmers and the people that I've come across along the way.
Let's keep with this and start with. I'm just contrasting attitudes towards sexuality in the cities versus in the countryside. Is there still a massive, largely unbridgeable chasm, or do you see the sexual revolution happening in the cities filtering down into county towns and smaller, even into villages?
Well, I think many of the things that Richard said, you can see it. The role of families is still there. But on the other hand, the young people today are much more open and free in the way that they operate. And I think that the experience that so many of the kids from these areas have had of going to the coast, to migrant workers, of spending time in the dormitories, it's opened it up. It's sort of the modern day equivalent of the Cultural Revolution, where all the kids went out to the countryside and started having sex together without parental supervision, and they've gone through that. There's a very practical approach to sex, I think, from Chinese people, and it's no nonsense. It happens, and the result is children and all the rest of it. And there is it's not clouded in all of the religious and the guilt and all of the emotional stuff which sex and sex issues are so often clouded with in the West. I don't sense that in the cities, and I don't sense it in the country. The answer to the question is, I think that the attitude towards sex is pretty constant across China.
Very interesting. And across time, though, that you've certainly seen marked changes.
Well, in terms when I first came here in the 70s, of course, everything was repressed and suppressed. And so it was very difficult to make a judgment call on what a girl's legs looked like because you couldn't see them. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that she didn't have them. In fact, I've got good evidence that they did exist. But in terms of, what people don't change. People have sexual desires. People have all these problems and issues.
But
and
attitudes change. I mean, societal norms change. Mores change.
That is true, but the base desires and motivations don't change, and so people were looking to get laid in the 70s, right, in China. Right. No matter where you were from, you were looking to get laid.
Yeah, it was a little tougher though, right? Getting laid. I mean,
there wasn't the open prostitution, and one thing that we'll never know. The question is, if you wanted to get laid in 1968 in Anhui province, how did you do it? Now, the answer may well be, and you can't record a nod in a podcast, but a shake of the head, that there may well be that there was none, but I find that hard to believe.
Jeremy, when you came here, it was in 1994, is that correct?
1995.
1995. Recall for us, paint a picture of what was it like in the city of Beijing? I mean, was there more or less open prostitution in the karaoke parlors? Was it more or less open? Did you see the scissorless barbershops, their telltale lavender lighting and the come hither skirts and boots?
I mean, I didn't live in the city of Beijing. I was in the countryside in what was the beginnings of the economic technological development zone. So I sort of lived in the countryside in a way, which was different from living in Beijing. But I think the makings of the way Beijing looks today in terms of those kind of things were already there. It was weird. I had a Lonely Planet travel guide when I first arrived that talked about how you could get into a lot of trouble if you were a Western man dating a Chinese woman because she might be arrested for being a hooker and you'd be thrown in jail for insulting a Chinese woman. In 1995, that was still kind of something that happened, and Beijing was making a transition from being a town where like Western ladies were like the party queens because the locals like didn't look good and were inaccessible to men, and there were fewer women than men, and there was this kind of weird transition that happened before a lot of Western guys started dating Chinese women. So it was just kind of changing, like in terms of the expatriate scene. And then in terms of sort of Chinese scenes, there were karaokes which always looked very expensive and looked very dodgy, and my new colleagues all told me about the dodgy women that one could find everywhere. But it wasn't like today where there are these hair salons with pink lighting that look like red light districts.
Right.
So I think it was sort of a transition. I don't know, Graham, you were here in the 90s.
Well, I remember going to places out in the middle of nowhere, right? And the Chinese cities in those days were incredibly dark. I'm talking 1980, around that time. Mm-hmm. Everything was dark. And I remember walking past a park in the center of some town, probably in Fujian province or something or other. And everything was dark, but there was an enormous amount of rustling going on out there in the bushes. Sure. And there were a lot of people who were, at the very least, getting it on up to a certain point. I don't know which base. But they were taking advantage of they were using their urges in a way that was acceptable within the very, very constrained context of that time.
Right.
I think it's difficult to know, because if you've been here a long time and you sort of know that like certain institutions are basically brothels, like a lot of karaokes or bathhouses or so-called hair salons. I mean, if you've been here a while, you kind of know what they look like, and somebody's told you or whatever, that it's basically a brothel. And if you haven't, you don't know. There's this guy, Jeremy Paxman, a very famous BBC news host, who was in China, I guess, about a year and a half ago. And I ended up taking him out to the Great Wall one day. And he said to me at some point that he kind of thought that there wasn't much prostitution in China. And I guess...
some reporter.
Well, I mean, he wasn't doing a story on prostitution, so, I'm not going to blame him. But, I mean, he kind of took a look around, and that was his conclusion. So, if you've been here a while, you know what the scene looks like. You might think it's very decadent, but it still might give the impression of being quite a Puritan country, no?
Richard, you actually have a number you put to it. I mean, or a best guess. You said something like 6 million prostitutes in this country. That strikes me as absurdly low, thinking in my head.
I think 6 is the percentage of GDP that prostitutes add to the Chinese economy.
No, that couldn't possibly be, because there's 8% growth. I mean, that means 6%. 6%.
That's what Pan Sui Ming, the Chinese sexologist, says. So you'd have to take that up with him.
That's insane. I can't. We live in a country where you can throw a rock and hit one of these sort of jack off station barber shops, right? But and somehow. Prostitution is quite winked at, but pornography is really strangled. I mean, pornography. I mean, they do a pretty good job of keeping it off the mainstream internet, at least.
They do. The Chinese government is obsessed with pornography. They do those sweeping the yellow campaigns periodically.
Right. So what gives? I mean, why the attitude toward? I mean, what seems like almost less harmful. I mean, I've heard a lot of different theories advanced, and one is that they see prostitution as a wealth transfer from richer to poorer, that this is effectively a way of wealth redistribution.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that?
The truth is, I just don't really know.
Right. Does that strike you as plausible?
No, I think that's bullshit, Kaiser.
Okay.
I think that it's to do with a kind of Leninist approach to media control. And because they have the systems in place for the media control, and pornography is kind of like, who really cares if they get rid of pornography? I mean, it doesn't affect anybody really. I mean, if you want porn, you can still find a way to get it if you're some government minister.
Sure.
So, and at the same time as getting rid of pornography, you can also get rid of, political stuff that you don't like, media you don't like. Right. So, it all kind
same filters work, right?
The same filters work. So it's a harmless target. Apartheid South Africa was the same. It had we had no porn in apartheid South Africa at all. It was very puritanical, and the same systems allowed them to control the politics and the media.
And
I think that's all it is.
That's right. The controls on pornography is a blind for the real purpose.
Right. Whereas prostitution, like everybody in the government needs hookers because they all married some woman they don't really like because it was better for their career. So the entire government would fall apart if you actually banned hookers.
Yeah, and also, I mean, prostitution is controlled at a local level. And I think in your book, Richard, you talk about this.
That's closely intertwined with the police. They operate together. They get paid their bribes. Now, prostitution...
Again, that's in every country, right?
Well, it's probably more in China. With the police, local police can force a prostitute to have sex with them. I'll bet that happens in other countries as well. When there are these sweeping the yellow campaigns, the local authorities will warn the barbershop workers, the massage parlor workers, and they'll be all prepared for it. And usually they're up and running again within a few days or a couple of weeks anyway.
Right.
Speaking of pornography that we just mentioned, can I just mention one of the most interesting observations that I made as I wrote this book was in regard to sex shops.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about, right? Sex shops.
Well, right here in Beijing, there's about 2,000 sex shops. And throughout China, there's 200,000 sex shops. They're thriving like never before. The very first one started in 1993. It's
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve.
Right, I remember.
Yeah.
It's right by my folks' house.
Right. Now he owns 3 sex shops now and a big booming online sex trade business, toy business. What most people don't know, however, is that Adam and Eve was brought about by the entrepreneur who started it, by a leading Beijing hospital and the China Sexology Association. In other words, it was in a sense sanctioned by and created by the government. And this goes back to what we said about talk radio, about people's sexual health. People who work in China's big sex shops don't see it as a sleazy business where you sell pornography.
It's not.
There's no pornography.
Yeah, dowdy women in white lab coats.
White lab coats. And they see their roles as healthcare professionals.
And they should.
And they should. But it's very, very different from what you see in the West, where we have the peep shows and piles of pornography and sleazy people hanging around. You go to these sex shops in China when you're having a sexual problem, when you're having premature ejaculation, when the wife can't stimulate the husband. And these people, the attendants, work with you to try to find solutions. That is so different from what you'll find in Europe, in the United States.
Seems positively enlightened to me.
It is. And it's just something that I don't think most people outside of China are at all aware of.
And yet, sex education is by no means enlightened in China. I mean, for younger people, right? I mean, my understanding is that it's often inaccurate. That kind of crazy notions are taught.
Sex ed in China is a total train wreck.
Yeah,
it's a disaster.
Let's hear about it.
It was mandated in 1986. So they had to teach it to children in elementary school. The professors or the teachers are usually so squeamish about it that either they skip it entirely or they teach it only from the perspective of biology and physiology. Nothing about sexual morality, nothing about a woman's right to refuse a sexual advance, nothing about contraception. This is for sex education taught in high school.
Wow.
And children are basically often told by their parents that they were found under a rock. There's no sex education to speak of from your family. Now, in Beijing and Shanghai, they're beginning to introduce some relatively enlightened programs using cartoons that actually show penetration and fertilization. But this is going to be a long, slow struggle because sex education throughout most of China, it either doesn't exist or it's shockingly bad and primitive.
Let's talk about the situation with gays, lesbians, transgendered people, bisexuals, LGBT people in China. What is their legal status and how has that evolved over the years?
Yeah, well, under Mao, they had no legal status. They were totally against the law, and if they were found trying to get together for sex, they could be arrested and their whole life would be ruined. They'd be stigmatized. That lifted, and in 1993...
It was 流氓罪, right? Hooligan
流氓罪,
crime.
yeah.
Hooliganism. Yeah. In 1993, homosexuality was taken off the list of
it was a mental
crimes.
illness, right?
First, it was taken off the list of hooliganism, of an actual criminal act. In 2001, it was removed from the list of mental illnesses. And around this time, we saw gay bars popping up, so to speak, like mushrooms. It's a funny metaphor. Most of the cities, even second-tier cities, had a gay bar, a couple gay bathhouses. There was something of a real gay revolution.
And there was gay media. I mean, I remember on Danwei.org in 2003, one of the first things we started covering was Manbox magazine.
You forgot one important detail is that I pointed that to you.
You did?
Yes.
I
got credit, actually.
Credit, Kaiser Kuo. Manbox magazine.
I remember
for sale on the newsstands in Beijing in 2003.
I remember.
My little brother's boyfriend was actually in one of the first issues of it. Right.
Are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Zhang Yi, he went out on he was manager at a couple of the big gay bars here for a while.
So things got much, much better for gays in China, but we always have to remember there's a very dark side to this.
Sure.
And that's that 80% of those gay people are going to get married. And that means millions and millions of people, like 40, 50 million people, are going to have to live behind a mask. They're going to have to live behind a lie. And
how different is that from most straight marriages you see in China?
It's a little different, but true. But the wife is going to wonder, why can't she stimulate her husband? She's going to think there's something wrong with her. The man's going to have to pretend. It's a heartbreaking situation, both for the homosexual who has to deny who he is or who she is, and for the spouse who's going to wonder all the time why things aren't working. This is really tragic. The Chinese are looking for gay Chinese are finding some practical solutions for this. What's very popular right now is for gay men to marry lesbian women.
Right.
So look, Mom and Dad, we're married. We're going to have a family maybe, so leave us alone. And then when they're back home, the gay man and the gay women go and do what they want.
One gets a beard, the other gets a wig, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There's even a yoga studio in Shanghai that has weekly parties where they introduce gay men to lesbian women so they can pick and choose and try to find someone to marry. It's a sad thing, but at least it's a better solution.
It's kind of an ingenious solution, yeah.
It is.
But gay men outnumber lesbian women in almost every society.
They
right?
do.
So that's what do we have any kind of statistical notion of how many gay people there are in China?
I believe Li Yinhe says there's about 50 million.
Okay, so it's considerably less than 1 in 10, though. That's
it
1
is.
in 5,
It is.
or 1 in.
Still a lot of people. It's a lot of people.
It's a lot. 1 in 20, right? 1 in
Yeah.
25. Right, but yeah, that's interesting. Now, what about recently we've had a couple of publicly staged gay marriages in Beijing. Of course, they're not legally recognized yet, but there is legislation introduced fairly frequently, fairly regularly
there is.
now.
It's mostly Li Yinhe who's suggested this.
Right.
The government really cracked down on her and told her to shut up about it. And she said they literally used the word "shut up" to her. In 2009, I was just amazed to see splashed across the front cover of China Daily a photograph of 2 gay men who had their symbolic wedding held right outside of Tiananmen Square.
Right.
Since then, I've seen numerous stories like this of gay men and gay women, and they're covered in a very positive light by the media, and the people who come to watch are applauding them. Sometimes I wonder, is China more ready for accepting gay marriage in the United States? We don't have that religious stigma. There's no gay bashing. There's no looking at them as sinners.
My distinct sense is that young people, the young generation, has really come around on this issue.
I don't think it's even the young generation. I mean, I remember, when I was first here in the 90s, people, kind of conservative, kind of engineer type people that I knew from work, would go to Thailand and kind of basically want to take their children to see the Ren Yao, the transsexual show.
Yeah.
And it wasn't considered like kinky or perverted.
Right.
It was just like, in Thailand they have the Ren Yao, so that's what we go and see. And I mean, it's kind of odd, but there is in some ways a very cool attitude towards, gender roles and sexuality in China that, despite a lot of puritanical things, leads to a society that's free of prejudice in certain ways.
My grandmother, who was sort of a child of the May 4th generation, where there were very, very liberal attitudes about sexuality, she knew that my younger brother was gay before any of the rest of us did. And I remember her sitting me down when I was 9, 10 out of the pool with a bologna sandwich and trying to explain to me that there was this tradition in Peking opera, men who prefer to act as women and blah, blah, and explained to me that my brother is one of these. I said, no, there's no way. And I thought her attitudes were incredibly enlightened.
How old was your brother?
He was only, he was 2 years younger than me, 8 or 9 years old. But it was pretty clear. I mean, he was, he always played with dolls. He liked to. He was very clearly gay. Now thinking back, there was just no mistaking it now. I mean, in retrospect, but that she was that perspicacious and kind of, figured it out. I thought really spoke well of her, and my parents have always been very cool with it too.
Well, I think in China, as Jeremy said, the younger generations are really showing a great deal of tolerance. I think the issue still remains if it's a member of your close family, are you going to be that tolerant?
Right. I mean, let's remember. I mean, while we're praising Chinese, of course, for liberal attitudes, but this is still a society, we should remember, where there is an awful lot of spousal abuse. Domestic violence is still quite rampant. Where women, as we've talked about on previous episodes, have an awful lot of they experience a lot of sexual harassment in the workplace. And, a lot of unreported rapes. So yeah, I mean, I hope we're not painting too rosy a picture here.
And gays are still stigmatized. It's not like they have it easy, and they're often associated with HIV/AIDS. So they don't have an easy time of it. It's getting better.
So I guess we could say, I mean, this is a progressive. This is not a progressive society, but it can be tolerant in places where one doesn't expect it to be.
Very well said.
We've talked about Li Yinghe a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about this leading researcher on sexuality in China?
Well, all I can say is that she's remarkably outspoken, and she's really a believer in complete sexual liberation. She wants to decriminalize prostitution. She wants to legalize gay marriage, and she wants to legalize sex parties. And she's frequently in conflict with senior people at the China Academy of Social Sciences. And there's been a few outbursts where she says she's not going to blog again because the CAS is getting on her case. But she's a crusader, and there's no one quite like her. I often wonder how she has the courage to stand up to the government like she does, and she does so repeatedly. She's by far the most cited and quoted sexologist in China.
Absolutely. Who are some of the other people who have been transformational in China in the era of reform and opening? I mean, I can think of a few off the top of my head, like Jing Xing, who is hosting this sort of Dancing with the Stars show right now. She's one of the judges. She's a very, very famous choreographer and dancer who is transgender. Jeremy, you've written extensively about the sex blogger Mu Zimei, right?
Mu Zimei and Ginseng are the two that I would come to mind.
I would also...
I mean, Mu Zimei basically introduced blogging to Chinese journalists,
right.
you know, and still is kind of an influential character on Weibo. Still writes stuff that has people entertained and enraged.
Did you hear her podcast a few years ago?
No.
That was quite something. She had a podcast of her having a 20-minute love session with a man, and the moans and the groans and the coming to climax. And that was on for about 10 days on the internet before it was pulled down.
Okay.
Right, I think we reviewed it on Downway, but I don't recall listening to it.
Yeah, I think it was 2007 or so.
Who are some of the other iconic figures who really changed things? I can think of the woman who won the very, very first Mengniu Chaonu contest.
Li Yuchun.
Li Yuchun.
Li Yuchun. Who, unfortunately, I sort of have this problem of naming because her fans
Yumi,
are supposed to be called Yumi,
right.
So my Chinese name, you know, sometimes people, it's going away now, but they used to think that I was some kind of, you know, Li Yuchun fan because my name means gold corn, so
right, of course.
like golden Li Yuchun fan. So yeah, but a very androgynous kind of looking woman who became the star of China's American Idol.
Sure,
basically.
Han Hong, the very, very famous singer.
Right.
She's also openly lesbian. Right. Other people who...
And quite, I mean, she doesn't look like a pretty Chinese
no,
flower-ass
absolutely
girl
not.
at all.
Absolutely
I mean, she's
not.
quite a butch-looking lady. Yeah.
Graham, who was the transsexual that I wrote about in the book? I forget her name, the dancer.
Jing
Jing
Xing,
Xing.
that's what I was
Jing
talking
Xing,
about.
okay.
She's the most famous by far.
Right.
And a very well balanced individual. I've met her and spoken to her on several occasions.
Yeah, I've met her many times. Yeah. She used to live in Beijing and before she went down to Shanghai. And then none of these people, to our knowledge, is persecuted or I mean, we have got, you know, who
No,
was
but
told to shut up.
transsexuals have it very, very hard. It's very hard to get permission to get that operation. And if you do, it's
really?
extremely expensive, prohibitively expensive.
Okay.
So transsexuals have a very hard time in China.
Because I saw a documentary about 6 different transsexuals. I mean, some of them were transgender female to male and some were male to female. And it was, I was actually surprised how many hospitals actually offer the procedure. And the attitude, at least in this particular documentary that I saw, I think I was actually involved, if I remember correctly, in subtitling it. it was quite the attitudes of all the healthcare professionals involved in it. It was admirable.
Well, that's wonderful.
So let's wrap up for now, and we'll certainly be revisiting the topic of sexuality in China in future shows, and hopefully Richard will come back and join us. But for now, let's move on to the section of our show where we do recommendations, and let's start with Jeremy over here, just because I'm arbitrarily pointing at you.
I'm going to do something that's probably against some rules or something, but recommend one of our guests' things, which is Graham Earnshaw's back catalogue of previously out-of-print works of English books about China, which I don't know, how many are available in digital versions or if you're still shipping the print versions, but Earnshaw Press has published a huge range of classic texts that I guess they were out of copyright, right? So you could basically get the copyright and print it without having to pay a royalty, but then you'd still print them, and a really good selection of books that are a lot of fun to page through and read about China through foreigners' eyes.
Yeah, I've got a good stack of them that Graham gave me some years ago. They're great, great stuff.
And including cartoons, a real miscellany of literary travel writing, journals, club gazettes.
Graham, give us some links. Make sure to email me with some links so we can put them on our recommendations page.
Will do. Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate that. It was a great pleasure to pull these old books that all about China in one way or another, and reflective particularly of the foreigner experience in China in the 20s and 30s and the 19th century. And really the aim was to show that the experience today is really simply a repeat of an experience that people had in the old days.
Nothing new under the sun.
Carl Crow for
exactly,
Jim
Carl
McGregor.
Crow and all of those guys.
Right.
And so we did a new forward on them, but we brought them out and I'll let people have another look at them. It's great.
Graham, what do you have for us?
People don't read poetry anymore, but there's a book, or at least not many people. It's something that's fallen away. But there is a wonderful book out there published very recently by a guy named Glyn Maxwell. And the book is called On Poetry, and it's on sort of bestseller lists in England at the moment. And it's well worth checking out. I'm reading it on Kindle, and he takes a very down-to-earth, normal attitude towards poetry. Poetry is something that you can read, you can enjoy, and it doesn't have to be weird, and it can rhyme. I love it. I really recommend it.
Okay, so Richard, what do you have for us this week?
Kaiser, just a couple of weeks ago, I saw you put up a post on Facebook recommending a book by Lawrence Wright, who wrote the wonderful history of Al-Qaeda, The Looming Tower.
Great book. Yeah.
The book that you recommended is called Going Clear, Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief.
That's great, yeah.
This was an amazing expose of Scientology that truly blew me away. I had no idea how wealthy and powerful and sleazy they are. I read the book in 2 nights, and I totally loved it. So thank you for that. I strongly recommend it.
What an amazing read. I mean, the thing that sticks in my head the most from that was that creepy chapter where he talks about L. Ron Hubbard's incantations. Remember those things that he sort of reads to himself on this tape. The Navy has no more power over you. You are able. I mean, it was these weird he calls them incantations.
Incantations.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What a bizarre.
So much about L. Ron Hubbard that is bizarre. His claiming to be an admiral and everything else, a nuclear physicist. It's just one bizarre thing after
Oh, God,
another.
yeah. I mean, the guy is just, he makes Li Hongzhi look absolutely respectable.
Yeah.
Your country produces people like that to
We
perfection,
do.
I have
We do.
to say.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize.
It's okay.
I'm going to make a couple of recommendations. Actually, I'm going to do 3 in quick succession. First, let's recommend this great piece in National Geographic by Ian Johnson about a trip he takes down the Grand Canal on a coal barge. It's in this month's National Geographic. Make sure to read it. He has another big piece in the New Yorker. This one is about a massive movie studio called Hengdian. Which is, I can't remember how many acres. It's something like 2,000 acres. It's enormous movie studio where they have all these replicas of things like the Forbidden City, and all sorts of the Bund in the 20s or the 30s, and it's used for costume dramas, and so he has a very thoughtful piece all about the rewriting of history and the sort of retouching of history in Chinese cinematographic arts. Great piece. And while I'm on the New Yorker, I recently read a collection of short pieces, nonfiction pieces by Jonathan Franzen, who's one of my favorite writers. He's, of course, the author of The Corrections and of Freedom. This one is called Farther Away, and it includes in it something that I had forgotten about. I had almost read it so long ago. I think it was written in 2008, before the Olympics. He came to Shanghai to do Shanghai to Ningbo to do a bunch of reporting ahead of the Olympics, and this was the piece that was produced out of that. It's about bird watchers in Shanghai. It's about his trip to find the people who had produced this bird-like cover for golf clubs that his brother had given him. It's an amazing piece. You really absolutely do need to read it, and it's very timely today. He talks to a bunch of birders who are in Shanghai, and it's about the environmental movement, the burgeoning environmental movement in China. Great piece. So those are my three. Graham, great to have you in the studio again.
My great pleasure.
And we'll see you next time you're in Beijing. And Richard, thanks for coming, man.
Hey, thank you for inviting me.
You've had a grueling couple of days. You've done this is your third interview today.
This is my third interview today. I was up in front of the Foreign Correspondents Club for over 2 hours, so it's been quite a day.
Well, we're all the more appreciative that you took the time to come sit with us here.
Thank you.
Great. Jeremy, man, I'll see you next week. Right?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, and we will see you next week on the Sinica Podcast. Take care.